So I want to thank the organizers for having me, giving me the opportunity to share this research with you. I'm very grateful to be here. The paper on U.S. regulation and conflict minerals and the rise of violence in the Congo is co-authored with Brian Vadheim. Brian was an undergraduate student of mine and is now a graduate student at the London School of Economics. So the paper does link to Ronald Coase, and I'll explain the link at the end of the presentation. In the paper, we challenge the widespread belief that people in poorly governed countries are cursed by their natural resources. We challenge a more particular or specific variant of that belief, that international demand for resources from poorly governed countries leads to more violent conflicts. In fact, we show that's not the case in the Congo and suggest whether or not that's a case more generally would depend on the specific context that we're addressing. So our context is Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's the 11th largest country in the world by area. It's the 19th most populated. It's richly endowed with natural resources, but it's poorly governed. In particular, the endowments that are of value now include what are called the 3 T's, tin, tungsten, and tantalum, and also gold. But those 3 T minerals are important components in modern electronic devices, cell phones, flat screen TVs, and so they're in heavy demand now. The minerals are mined informally from sites that are often called artisanal mining sites, which just means there's almost no capital involved, and it's a very labor-intensive process. To the extent there's capital, it's buckets, pickaxes, it's very labor-intensive mining. And the informal mining industry has supported perhaps 8 to 10 million people in terms of giving them an economic livelihood. Many warlords and armed militia groups benefit and are directly involved in this trade, and sometimes those warlords and militia groups commit brutal acts of violence. Observation of that fact has led to human rights advocacy groups who have convinced themselves that people in the Congo are afflicted by the resource curse, in particular that Western demand and Eastern demand for these electronic devices is causing conflict, causing violence in the Congo. This flyer that I have an image of on the slide is from a group called Save the Congo, but there's other human rights advocacy groups that have a similar mission of connecting mineral use with violence in the Congo. This particular flyer says at the bottom, "Don't support the ongoing war in the Congo caused by competition for the minerals in our cell phones, GPSs, and game systems." These human rights groups, a consortium of them, have lobbied Congress for several years prior to 2010, but they were successful in 2010 in that their goals were implemented into law as Section 1502, or the conflict minerals section of the U.S. Dodd-Frank Act. Of course, the U.S. Dodd-Frank Act is mainly concerned with regulating domestically the U.S. financial sector, but it has this rider in the bill that requires publicly traded companies, big electronics companies like Intel and Apple and Hewlett-Packard, to disclose their source of minerals. And if their source of minerals, if their sourcing of minerals could have financed illicit armed groups in the Congo, the companies are required to publicly disclose that. So, co-sponsor of the bill, Barney Frank, advertised this section of the law as a way to cut off funding to people who kill people, was his quote. Shortly after the Dodd-Frank bill was enacted, the domestic government of the Congo banned mining in 3 of its provinces. This mining ban would not have occurred in the absence of the Dodd-Frank Act. It promulgated that. And then the as a follow-up to the act, there was an official boycott of the 3 Ts, tin in particular, from a consortium of high-tech companies. So the impact, the collective or aggregate impact of this regulation is, even though it did not prohibit companies from purchasing in the area, it acted as, at least commentators claim that it acted as a swift and effective de facto embargo on the purchases of the 3 Ts from this area. So this figure that I present here is certainly consistent with that claim. It shows the official exports of tin from the country, and you see that the exports plummeted after 2010, after the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. Prior to the Dodd-Frank Act, there's a pretty clean relationship between the world price of tin and production from the country. After the act, although the world price of tin was high, production from the DRC or exports were low. Because one might be suspicious of official export data from the Congo, where exports aren't tracked quite rigorously, one might wonder if, in fact, the data that I just showed you represents what truly happened to mineral production in the area. And so to try to validate those data, if you will, we collected satellite imagery on deforestation around mining sites and the rate of deforestation before and after the Dodd-Frank Act. And what we find from that analysis of imagery is that the rate of forest loss really slowed around the 3T mines after Dodd-Frank relative to the rate of deforestation before. But what's really an interesting and important part of this whole story of the impacts of this regulation is that the regulation did not effectively slow the mining of gold. Gold is listed as a conflict mineral in the regulation, but it's de facto exempt because it's so easy to smuggle in small quantities. And what we find is that the rate of gold mining was not impacted to much of an extent. So what I've shown you is that the regulation was effective in terms of reducing 3T mining, but the question, of course, is what impact did it have on the people of the Congo? Was it effective in improving human welfare? And there's debate about that. One of the human rights groups, the Global Witness group, has a quote that correlates the reduction in armed groups' profit with success of the legislation. So the quote says, "The passage of conflict minerals legislation has helped lead to a 65% drop in armed groups' profits from trade in tin, tantalum, and tungsten." And they view that as evidence of a successful regulation. Commenters on the ground, including a reporter who visited the Congo in the aftermath of the Dodd-Frank Act and talked to a lot of people, local people in the Congo, said, for locals, the Dodd-Frank Act has been an economic catastrophe. Remember, there was 8 to 10 million people that were making a living from livelihoods related to artisanal or informal mining. And this act, according to this reporter, put many, many people out of business, took away money from families that they were using to send their kids to school, raised unemployment rates, had a devastating economic effect, is the view of some. That view is generally shared by groups in the Congo, including a group called the Pole Institute that's in Goma in eastern Congo. And the Pole Institute has this quote that I think is worth sharing. They say, "The conflict minerals campaign misunderstands the relationship between minerals and conflicts in the eastern DRC." So what we do in this paper is we contribute fodder to this debate, and we ask the question, what was the impact of the conflict minerals legislation? What impact did it have on violence itself, on conflict? The stated goal of the act was to reduce violence, and we ask, did it? And we find that it didn't. In fact, the evidence suggests that the legislation substantially increased violence against civilians and in some cases battles between armed groups. So that's what we find. And the question is why? Why would, if you believe the evidence that I'll share with you in a little while, why would this legislation increase violence? And to build a theoretical framework for understanding why, we build on Mansur Olson's bandit metaphor, and we use this as an effort to understand how the policy would affect the incentives and the behaviors of the armed groups. And so the idea, in short, is that armed groups can be roving bandits. Roving bandits want to loot and take what they can now with little regard for the future. Or they could be stationary bandits. Stationary bandits are more like, in the Olson metaphor, they're more like organized criminals. In fact, they're more like governments, if you will. Stationary bandits tax production, like governments, like organized criminals, and hence they have a long-run stake in economic productivity. It's very different than roving bandits who take what they can now and care little about the future. So in this metaphor and in our theory, stationary bandits aren't incentivized to hurt their workforce. Their workforce consists of productive people, labor, and they want to, in fact, protect the workforce because they can tax that workforce. So that these images show you, in fact, what many of the armed groups were doing before Dodd-Frank. They stationed themselves at mining sites. They charge a tax to miners who enter, and then they provide some crude form of protection for them. So just a small elaboration on those points with a diagram of theory. I mean, basically the way we've set this up is we imagine a starting point, call it time period T-1, if you will, where there is something like a stationary bandit regime. Armed groups are stationed at mining sites, and there's evidence this is what they were doing before Dodd-Frank, and they're taxing labor at mining sites. And under this system, there's relatively high productivity and something like full employment. So Dodd-Frank comes in, period T=0, it changes the incentives. It shortens the planning horizons for militia groups. In fact, it lowers the local prices that miners and militia groups would get for the 3T minerals. There's evidence that this happened. So it makes it less enticing for militia groups to keep their armed capital, if you will, at these mining sites. And it raises the relative price of gold because, remember, gold is de facto and exempt. So in time period T=1, after the act, we predict it changes the system into something more like a roving bandit regime where you have more looting and you have battles. But you don't have battles over 3T sites, you have battles over gold mining sites. And so to test these ideas, we collected data on violent conflict, on the location of gold mining sites and 3T mining sites, on areas where the U.S. State Department deemed controlled by illicit militia groups, and areas that weren't on the State Department's radar. And we make comparisons of how much looting of civilians was there before and after Dodd-Frank, how many battles were there, and we make these comparisons inside versus outside regulated areas, which we think of the unregulated areas as something like a control group, and then we make more precise comparisons based on what kind of mineral endowments are there, what's happening where there's gold, what's happening where there's tin, etc. And this, I'll just show you some of our results with graphics, and then I'll conclude. This graphic here shows the monthly episodes of looting in the targeted regulated areas before and after Dodd-Frank over 2004 and 2012. What we see is that looting episodes increased about threefold after Dodd-Frank Act. This picture allows a comparison of what we might think of as a control group and the regulated areas. And it shows the monthly episodes of looting, but now we zoom in from 2008 to 2011 just to get a clearer picture of what's going on in that short window around the regulation. And you see that there's a dramatic increase in looting in the regulated areas, but not an increase in the control group areas. So this image suggests that it's the legislation itself that is causing more looting rather than some other political and economic factors that would be affecting the Eastern Congo more generally. I'll just mention that this figure shows something about the dynamics of the change in looting, which our theory speaks to. We see that there's an increase in looting first in mining areas, and then it spills over into agricultural areas and other regions. And this is consistent with the idea that if the policy converted stationary bandits into roving bandits, they would loot places beyond the shut down mining areas. By contrast, we don't find strong evidence that battles increased as a result of Dodd-Frank, but we do find that battles increased specifically in areas endowed with gold. And so what it looks like what happened as a consequence of Dodd-Frank is that the incentives to battle, they were displaced from generally mining areas into areas where there's gold, but this is because the regulation increased the relative price of gold. So it displaced battling, it did not eliminate it or reduce it. We do more formal statistical analysis, and in general we find evidence that the policy increased looting and it increased violence against civilians. It increased battles, but only in these gold mining areas. So let me conclude, and I want to conclude by saying we think the evidence is pretty strong that Dodd-Frank increased violence in the short run. We conclude our analysis in 2012. That's how long our data extend. The law was passed in 2010. In that window, we think the evidence is pretty strong that it caused more violence. The long-term effects remain to be seen, and one of the goals of Dodd-Frank is to reduce revenue to armed groups that they could use to buy guns, support larger armies, etc. And so the long-term effects remain to be seen. There's reasons to be skeptical that the long-run effects will be beneficial. I'm happy to discuss that, but it's not what our paper addresses. In terms of broader lessons, I'll say two things, and then I'll sit down. One broader lesson is obvious, I think, is the resource curse idea. The resource curse itself is complex, and it's unlikely to be solved by top-down blanket policies like embargoes and boycotts. In fact, this is a cautionary tale about top-down interventions that may misunderstand what's happening locally and change relationships between powerful and powerless people. And finally, this crude and formal institutional arrangements, like having armed groups at mining sites, that may be better for both violence and economic productivity than the alternative, which is something closer to anarchy. I claim that this study is connected to Ronald Coase. This is the connection, in my opinion. In Coase's paper, The Problem of Social Cost, he has this quote, and I think it's about fundamentally the unintended consequences of policies. He says, analysis concentrates attention on particular deficiencies in the system and tends to nourish the belief that any measure which will remove the deficiency is necessarily desirable. It diverts attention from those other changes in the system which are inevitably associated with a corrective measure, changes which may well produce more harm than the original deficiency. In the case of the Congo, it's extremely unfortunate that there's violence and acts of brutality to control the minerals, but this may be a case where the corrective action made things worse rather than better. Thank you.